Welcome everybody to Franc Analysis. I'm your host Franco, and I'm joined today by Dak Rulo, founder of Overwritten.org and the host of his own show on YouTube named after himself. It's great to have you back, Dak, for the third time, I believe, right?
Yeah, I believe it's at least the fifth time.
Yeah, how are you doing today, Dak?
Oh, I'm hanging in there. Yeah. Had a busy couple of weeks, I'll put it that way.
Yeah, so I wanted to continue some of the conversation that you were having with Jordan of the Yellow Brick Road about morality. So I asked you guys whether morality is something that's objective. You said it was not. So just for the people who missed that debate, which I highly recommend people to check out because it's a really great discussion, could you explain to people what your stance is on morality?
Well, first of all, morality is obviously not objective. I mean, I think even Jordan came to that realization pretty quickly as we were having the conversation that if I believe that drinking alcohol is immoral, obviously you can have a different stance on that, and so there's no way to definitively state whether it is morality is definitely not something that is objective. My own stance on morality is I tend to lean towards the Nietzschean critique of morality. Nietzsche said that morality is a fiction, that it is a self-destructive anti-philosophy, and it is one that we should ultimately replace with the concept of virtue. Saying that you don't believe in morality is not a license to do whatever you want or to act destructively. It's simply to recognize that the compulsion to do good, as it's nebulously defined, you have to have the right motivation or incentive. And that's where virtue, in Nietzsche's opinion, and probably in mine, seems to be a much stronger foundation for desirable human conduct.
So why do you think morality exists? How did morality come about in humans?
Well, most of what we might call virtue could also be referred to as morality. I mean, the concept, Nietzsche says that morality is an attempt to bring about the weaker elements of human nature. He said that that was an attempt to emphasize weakness and ultimately sickness and self-destructiveness, bringing about the demise of the species. I don't know that I would go that far. But morality, as we define it, it tends to have, it seems to be predicated on the idea that if we behave in a way that is good for the species at large, that will lead to the preservation of the species. In other words, if everybody is behaving in a self-centered and externally destructive manner, it isn't going to be long before we see that the species is undone. That's certainly reflected in the corporate sector. We see that these oil executives and military contractors, they don't care if the entire planet is annihilated as long as they receive their extremely generous payments. So a compulsion to try to preserve the species and or the planet would appear to be the foundation of at least a secular form of morality.
So I think that people often, when it comes to people who believe that morality is objective, I think that they're confusing that with consciousness, which I'll get back in a bit. But morality, we see, is tied to survival. We developed certain rules that correlate with our survival. For example, why do we have a sense of like sanctity? Like, why do religions believe in having too much sex can be sinful? Well, if you think about it evolutionarily, humans who, back when we were I would say hunters and gatherers, those who would have a lot of sex, they have a higher chance of getting a sexually transmitted disease. Maybe that some of those diseases could have led to death. So that's why in order to survive, they had to develop some sense of morality when it comes to sanctity. I'm sure you could probably think of other examples in which survival had its role in morphing the way that we view things that are moral. Could you think of any other examples?
Well, I'm not sure that STDs were a prevalent concern in hunter-gatherer societies. I would think, if anything, the sex would have been a hindrance because of the creation of new infants that have to be
Right.
fed. Pregnancy in a primitive society would pose a much greater danger to women, which is why you see many in many animal species, the female is less willing to reproduce than the male. Now, you were talking about evolution having some impact on our moral code or moral consciousness. You definitely see how. I mean, look at the Bible. You can see that a lot of the behaviors that are considered justifiable or even honorable, such as a lot of warmongering behavior, we at least like to tell ourselves that that is not part of our moral code today. I understand that our government engages in a lot of, it tries to get people to think that the military is a benevolent institution, but nevertheless, we tend to think that bloodshed and military conquest, we like to tell ourselves that those are bad things. That would represent an ideological shift from the past. The reason for that would probably be, obviously, having lived through such a litany of violent conflicts and having so many unstable. The thing is that when we see that humans having lived through so many violent periods of history, they've seen the consequences of violent warfare. They obviously try to create a more stable society where they're not going out and engaging in bloody conquest. So I don't know if you would call that an evolutionary development of morality, but you could see that it's historical development at least.
Yeah, I think that is more so people being more conscious about their actions, learning from history, and then thinking more about, okay, if we do this, if we engage in this, will this in the end cause harm to me? So with warfare, there's potential for, if you attack a country, they could act aggressively back towards you, thus endangering your survival. So that I would say is more so thinking more consciously about what will cause harm to you. And that's what I think people can get more confused about when it comes to morality versus consciousness. How would you define consciousness?
Well, it's a pretty ambitious thing to try to define. Consciousness. I mean, it would be. I wasn't expecting that one. I would say it's one's perception, one's mental perception, which is why I don't think that consciousness can be objective. I mean, there are people who say that virtual reality is reality because it is one's consciousness. It is one's conscious experiences played out in environment. So who's to say that it isn't real? Theodore Roszak wrote quite a bit about that. There was actually a lot of good literature being written on that in the 50s and 60s that has been pretty much erased from our academic history. Now, if it's boiled down, though, just to one's perception of their experiences, environment, stimuli, the world around them, etc., obviously you can see that consciousness becomes subjective pretty quickly. I mean, I might be enjoying this conversation and you might not be enjoying this conversation. There isn't a way to say whether the conversation is objectively enjoyable or not. It depends on one's perception of it. So consciousness, in my mind, it becomes pretty clear that it's subjective. You had said earlier that what a lot of people call morality is actually consciousness. That's what you had said at the beginning of this video. You said that, Jordan, I was wondering if maybe you could explain that view to the audience.
Yeah, so consciousness, the way I view consciousness is you're thinking about more so like what you're viewing things more in like a third person perspective, right? So you're trying to view things more objectively when you're looking at things consciously. Whereas morality, you're trying to label things as whether it's like good or bad. And some of those ideas are ingrained in us since we were infants. You know, your parents tell you don't do that because that's bad, blah blah blah. And then over time we start to we start to have these rules ingrained in us and we don't realize how they came about. Um, and some of those rules are we just believe them when they're really just assumptions. When really if we were to look at things objectively, we could we could um, we could see if like something will objectively lead us into a positive direction towards I don't know, raising people's consciousness in a societal way, advancing technology, advancing um, the world so that we, for example, take better care of our environment, of our planet, so
Well,
that in the end.
see, the thing is, when you employ the term objectively, I think that's where you come to the end of morality, because morality cannot be objective. That's the problem, is
Right.
that because it is by definition subjective, you can't bring objectivity into it. I mean, I don't really know I don't know how anybody could think that morality is objective if they've thought about it for more than just a couple of minutes. It's like in a lot of philosophical exercises, they will ask if people think that there are such things as false beliefs, and many people will say, no, 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 there's things depends on your personal perception. But you can immediately point out to them that if I say that there are such things as false beliefs and you disagree with me, then you're saying that my belief that there are false beliefs is false. So the attempt to define morality objectively, you're going to walk into walls within the first couple of minutes. Trying to determine what is best for the species objectively is also a losing exercise. I mean, there are people who would argue that eugenics and that kind of unnatural selective breeding and genetic and social engineering would be what is best for the species. And perhaps it would result in the creation of human beings who are physically and intellectually superior to the creatures who exist at present. But that doesn't mean that we would say that is better. It could be that that is a dehumanized anti-humanity. And so trying to talk about what is objective, I think objectivity has a very limited function.
When it comes to morality, also it's like you can never make anybody happy with it because everybody has their own perception of what's moral. And we see over time what used to be considered moral is now considered immoral. Like for example, thousands of years ago, being homosexual was viewed as something immoral. But now, as time has passed by, we have a new definition of of how we view homosexuality. Some people still view it as immoral, but more people are starting to see it as there's nothing immoral about that. It's just the way something is. Um, so 100 years from now, people will have an overall different perspective of what's moral and immoral. And I think that no matter what time period you're at, there's still going to be some people that are resisting what used to be considered moral to the majority of people versus what we're trying to transcend to into the future of what the overall population will think of what's moral.
Yeah, but we don't know who the we are. We don't know who the majority of the population are. I mean, we're talking. You said, like, you're talking about the example on gay rights.
Yeah.
There are still many people, and I don't think that the anti-gay faction is some kind of negligible minority. I mean, I think that there is a very widespread contempt for gays and lesbians that simply is not allowed to be expressed in mainstream media. It's not a perspective that I endorse, but I think that there is definitely a widespread hatred for that kind of identity or behavior that just isn't permitted a lot of popular expression. I mean, we're looking at right now where we've tried to convince ourselves that America overcame its racist issues after the Civil War, or at the very least after the civil rights movements, and we can see that we were grossly and sadly mistaken. So when we try to tell people that they are, when we speak of like a moral majority, I don't know what that term really means. Mm-hmm. And when we say that, when we try to condemn someone's actions by saying it's immoral, I don't think that charge really has any kind of impact on people, because their moral codes could be very different from yours or mine. I mean, the conservative, the neoconservative subculture believes that the progressive subculture is immoral. They believe that a lot of the efforts to regulate people's speech and thoughts is immoral. So trying to condemn something on moral grounds, I think it becomes harder and harder to justify the further we go in the history of our species.
Yeah, so we see some conflict happening now with how we view the way in which we're taking statues down. We have a group of people that are thinking that keeping them up is immoral, versus people that want to keep them up think that it's immoral to take them down. So what do you think are the objective consequences would be of having them up versus keeping them down? Do you think that there is some objectivity that could lead to some harm that could happen in the future?
Well, in the debate I had with Jordan, I was explaining that I don't condemn the violent protests on their face, because I think that the violent outbursts are more of a symptom of a broader problem rather than the cause. I think to identify the protests as the cause of our dysfunction is very short-sighted, which is, of course, why it appeals to many of the neoconservative commentators out there. The statues are a similar issue. I mean, here in New Hampshire, in front of the state capitol, we have a statue for Franklin Pierce. The reason we have that is because he was the only United States president born in New Hampshire. And Franklin Pierce, it's quite obviously a symbol of pride. We get to say to ourselves, you see, New Hampshire, he's New Hampshire's favorite son, is the expression we use. And he was, a person we could look up to as a great lawyer and a man of great principles and a good family man who had a troubled history and life that he overcame. And that's wonderful, but it also obscures the fact that he supported slavery and he appointed slave owners to his presidential cabinet, and he was a very destructive force in the country's attempt to bridge the racial gap. And so Franklin Pierce's statue out there, it is inappropriate to put that up in the most prominent part of the town and say, this is a man to whom we should aspire. It's grossly inappropriate. And it's also somewhat ironic because there's a statue on the other side of the Capitol to John Hale, whose daughter was briefly engaged to John Wilkes Booth. Now, the thing is, so when we have Franklin Pierce's statue out there, what we're saying is that this is a good role model for us. That is obviously the purpose of that statue, is to honor him. But the man was not honorable. So we need to find better role models. And there are certainly many artists and writers and poets who have lived in New Hampshire over the centuries who would probably make a much better role model than Franklin Pierce. Yet the fact that that statue remains and that we have a college named in his honor, the question is, what kind of moral system do we have? What kind of virtuous system do we have that tells us that that is the kind of person to whom we should aspire to be?
So where do you think that our morality or whatever in what direction do you see it going in? Like, we keep setting all these rules, like right now, and those rules keep changing. Where do you think those rules are going to lead to, and let's say in like the next 100 years?
Well, it's a little hard to see that far down. I mean, I don't think that the people fighting in the Civil War could have envisioned what happened in the 1960s. The problem I see is that when we talk about erasing history, that's a misguided statement. But one of the issues I noticed in these protests that I attended was many of these protesters certainly do not have any kind of historical or political understanding. What they are doing is that they're not out there because they're political scientists. They're out there because they recognize a gross injustice, which would be the murder of George Floyd, and they're able to respond to that, because you don't have to be remarkably intelligent to see that something terrible occurred there. You don't have to be a scholar to understand that, which is why it has become a mass movement. But the problem is that if we don't recognize that the system that gave rise to the culture that enabled that officer to murder George Floyd, or to think that he could get away with killing Floyd, that system remains largely unchanged over the decades. And so most people want to try to alter it politically. They want to try to replace Donald Trump with a Democrat, as if that's going to make some kind of meaningful difference. Yeah. And so because the public remains historically, not just historically illiterate, but also historically intolerant, there is a huge reluctance in the United States to read, to try to examine history, to obtain a true understanding of it. As long as we remain ignorant and benighted in that way, we can expect to keep walking into the same walls over and over again. So these protests, as encouraging as they may appear to be upon initial glance, I don't think we can expect any kind of meaningful long-term improvement to result from them.
Yeah, so that's the thing that people need to understand, is that a lot of the problems that we see is the result of a system that was set up for generations ago, and they build upon a system that existed generations before that. And so we get distracted with like all these personalities, and we start blaming these different people. We start attacking different groups and viewing them as immoral. They don't see that they developed their morality because of the system that they grew up in. So what do you think is the solution to getting people to think more systemically, rather than to look on the surface at this tribalism that you see? How do we get them to get a better understanding of what's actually happening, as opposed to just looking at blaming certain groups of people?
Yeah. Well, we have to first begin by examining the problem in its depth, because it goes much deeper than people think. I mean, it's very comforting to think that all we have to do to solve the problem is vote for a particular politician, and that will solve all of our problems. It appeals to our sense of laziness, and I think I've talked to you about that before. If not, it was on Israel Daily Show, where I said that politics is a form of laziness, and that was a sentiment that Nietzsche echoed as well, saying public opinion is private indolence. The problem is that, as I said a moment ago, we have a culture that is actively hostile towards critical analysis and a sincerity of see, I'm fumbling when I'm trying to criticize people for not being thoughtful enough. The problem is that we have a culture that's actively hostile towards that. I mean, you see what happens. That if you go out and you express an opinion that is contrary to the prevailing mainstream narrative, you are going to be met with contempt, indifference, or bewilderment, if not outright disgust. That's what happened to me in Iowa. Was I was assaulted because a person did not like my support of Julian Assange. And so there is a widespread contempt for those who break away. They are ostracized. We saw that when I asked Pete Buttigieg about Julian Assange. The audience applauded Buttigieg's completely meaningless answer in order to demonstrate their solidarity. They want to feel like they're part of the group. And so in order to feel like part of the group, you're going to have to be thoughtless, you're going to have to be dishonest, you're going to have to be a fool. And there is a very disturbing, insidious, but aggressive and pervasive peer pressure that exists in American culture to try to keep people ignorant. The establishment does not want people to think, and so it moves to this point where if you are being thoughtful, you are going to find yourself ostracized socially. So the solution is, in the first place, you have to have people who want to think about these things. You can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. We have to remember that if people do not want to be unplugged from the matrix, then they are not going to accept reality, and they're going to prefer the artificial program. Ergo, we have to recognize, we have to choose our battles in that sense. But we also have to show for the people who are being unplugged that there is a welcoming environment for them, that they can come into the fold and they can meet up with like-minded individuals. I mean, this is a social, you can call it social networking, to use a rather technocratic term. But there is some legitimacy to that you can say to people, you can build their own community. That's how I met my girlfriend. And so in the context of the question of how do we get people to that point, you have to show that the community can survive. You have to show that we are serious about this and we're not just looking to be publicity whores or to create a alternative corporate structure in the media that is ultimately no different from the one that we are rebelling against.
Would you say this is more of a human problem than a problem with that's just in the U.S. with thinking tribally, just turning your mind off and clapping whenever you hear other people who support the same candidate that you do start clapping, despite you even fully analyzing what that candidate actually said? I would say you could see that in any country. So how can we evolve to start to think more critically and break away from the group think? Like how do we get people to stop thinking so tribally when they're in these situations?
Well, as I said, you have to show them that there is an alternative community. Like, one of the things that troubles people is if you've been living thoughtlessly your entire life, if your mental powers have rusted over and frozen, and one day you are unplugged then from the matrix, then you're going to look around and recognize that your family is probably pretty thoughtless, your spouse is probably pretty thoughtless, maybe even your children are pretty thoughtless, and that's very painful and frightening. I had the benefit of growing up in an abusive home, so I didn't have any affectionate connection towards my family, and so also the everlasting integrity and infallibility of the family unit, I learned the truth about that pretty early on. But for other people, it's obviously much harder to come to terms with those things. You think about the people who live their whole lives watching sports and enjoying it because it's entertaining. They don't want to, if you present them with terrifying information about how these sports leagues are actually run, the terrible social consequences that result from them, the grotesque corporate structures that are involved, the damage to communities. I mean, if you start presenting them with that information, they're going to get very defensive. It's Plato's allegory of the cave, where people are frightened by the light outside of their dark, anti-intellectual womb. Now, to answer the question you asked at the beginning, which was about if this is a particular problem exclusive to the United States or if it is a broader issue, I would say certainly it would not be limited to the U.S. I mean, we see how demagoguery and political fanaticism can arise anywhere. But I would say that in other countries, what we tend to see, for the most part, not invariably, but typically, is more of a desire to bury one's head in the sand and not to think about the issues that are at stake. I mean, I remember spending some time in Bangkok with a lot of British and other European expats, and you could see that they were willing to have a cordial conversation about politics, respecting one another's differences. But they weren't looking to. They didn't get very animated about it, and I think that was because they didn't really have strong political convictions one way or another. They wanted to just focus on their entertainments and their lifestyles and their sexual pursuits, and not really think about those deeper, more serious problems. And that kind of complacency is very widespread. I mean, you can see that in pretty much any country you visit. You can see that in this country, for that matter. It's just becoming more rare in this country because of the increasing politicization of our media.
So then, would you say that morality is also a thoughtless thing, or would you say that are some elements to morality that is something spiritual, something supernatural that could probably drive people to stay, like, not cause harm to other people or cause harm to themselves? Or is it an instinctual thing, something that's biological? Or is it a combination of all three, or more so mainly one or the other? What would you say?
Well, I don't know that I would say it's one or the other. I mean, we've seen altruism in monkeys. We see in the wild, monkeys will sometimes just feed other species with their excess food, and there's the question, where is that coming from? Morality is certainly not worthless. I don't think Nietzsche would have said that.
Mm-hmm.
Morality there is definitely a very strong benefit to moral inquiry, to moral skepticism, to moral debate. I mean, when we're asking ourselves, where do morals come from? What is the function of morality? Is the thing as morality? Is morality a tenable concept? These are all great questions to ask. But you can see that it also requires a great deal more effort than simply invoking morality thoughtlessly. If somebody says, why can't I own slaves? And you say, because it's immoral, what you're doing is you're not really thinking about the issue. You're not coming up with a reason why slavery is immoral. You're just trying to evoke this nebulous notion of morality, which leaves you vulnerable to all kinds of interrogations, many of them dishonest. I mean, because since morality is subjective, it doesn't work as an argument. You have to analyze what is actually wrong with slavery. And there are things that are definitely wrong with it, but I'm not convinced that the moral element is really the prevailing issue here. At the very least, you have to go a little bit deeper than that. I think saying it's immoral is the beginning, it's the surface, but you have to get beneath that to obtain a real understanding. Otherwise, you're just not going to know what you're talking about, just as a matter of course.
So then, people who say things like slavery is immoral, and we were discussing about how morality is subjective, what would be the objective reason for why slavery is wrong? Or is there even an objective reason for why something like slavery is wrong?
Yeah. Well, objectively, again, that word poses so many hindrances. This is my take on slavery, is that slavery raises the question, does that actually make a human being strong? If I'm a slave owner, does that make me a man of strength? This is something that Nietzsche talked about, was trying to make human beings as strong as they could possibly be. Slavery makes a human being weak. And I'm not just talking about the slave, I'm talking about the slave owner. In being a slave owner, I am lazy, I become greedy, I become thoughtless, and I become indifferent to the people around me. At the very least, it's going to be hard for me to make the argument that we need to improve the world around us when I am missing all of the people trapped in indentured servitude on my backyard. And that to me is a more clear-headed objection to the pro-slave argument than just simply saying it's immoral. There are obviously many other things you could say besides. It's a grotesque institution. It plays into the worst of capitalist excess. You can see how ugly people, meaning intellectually ugly, not physically ugly people, will profit and thrive and prosper within the slave market. There are all sorts of evidences of what is wrong with slavery. Also, enslavement produces weak human beings within the chains. You can see how enslaved people, they are crippled intellectually, they are physically, and they end up being damaged psychologically. I mean, you're not producing strong human beings within that system. And if you are producing brilliant human beings through enslavement, then the question becomes, why can't that be achieved without slavery? So I don't see any. I don't think that there's any way a person would say slavery is a good thing without first benefiting personally and selfishly from slavery and then trying to search for justifications after the fact. Like there's a dishonesty there because of the order of discovering slavery and then trying to justify it. It's like shooting an arrow into the wall and then painting a bullseye around it. So that would be the beginning of a discussion on the morality of slavery or the immorality of slavery. But it's so much different from just using the 5-letter word of moral and trying to shut down the argument or the discussion before it even begins.
So it is still a subjective thing. Because one person may perceive it as something good, another person will perceive it as something bad, but it's definitely an unconscious thing to have slavery because of the point that you brought up about how the slave owner will now be consumed by greed, he'll be consumed by lethargy, and then in the end he's causing harm to himself. So that right there is an objection, right? That's something objective.
Yes.
He's not being conscious. He's not thinking about the consequences of something like that. There could be a rise up, and then they end up killing you for mistreating you, right? For mistreating the slaves. So I think that's what I meant originally when I was talking about how people confuse morality with consciousness. Is not thinking things through and not thinking things through enough.
Yeah. Right, but then if we take my argument that I just made, the question becomes, where exactly in that did morality even come up?
Yeah.
Like if you have never heard of morality in your life, you could look at what happens in a system of slavery and you would say, I don't like this because of X, Y, and Z. I don't like this stuff. But see, morality doesn't come up until later. I think that's one of the reasons why Nietzsche questioned the authenticity of morality, was he was wondering, where does this come from? It seems to be an unnatural notion. I mean, I'm not prepared to embrace such a radical view.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think there was definitely something to it. And I could not disagree more with Jordan when he said that morality is objective. I mean, we can't even prove that it exists, never mind that it's objective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean, slavery is not always depicted as a bad thing in the Bible, even.
Yeah, it's made up, like how we were discussing earlier. It's tied to survival. Us labeling things as good or bad is tied to survival, because if we consider something good, then we're saying, it gives us pleasure, it adds something, benefits us some way for our survival. Whether if we label something bad, we're labeling that as something that's not going to benefit us in our survival or, pleasure us in some kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to come back to this subject. I want to read a bit more about consciousness and morality, and we can further discuss. I've never had a conversation about this with anyone. So the more I discuss this, the more practice I get, and this also adds a lot to the way we view things in our politics and in events that happen. Should we not do things just because we view it as morally bad, or is there an objective consequence that will happen? That's being conscious, is thinking about what will the consequences be if we do something like this. Is there a consequence to keeping statues up of people who have caused harm? We're seeing that happen right now with people taking these statues down. If these people were happy with the way our system is set up, they wouldn't be taking these statues down, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. obviously. I mean, it's not about, like, the statue doesn't do anything. The statue just stands there. But the question is, why did we build the statue? Why is it something that we look up to? If we tear the statue down, what do we want to replace it with? I mean, there's plenty of historical figures who are far more grotesque than Franklin Pierce. I mean, I would argue that Barack Obama was in many ways more despicable than Franklin Pierce, so putting up his statue in Pierce's place would not be appropriate. Nevertheless, because of that, if a group of protesters go out and tear down that statue, which I don't think they will, but if they do, the question is, have they torn it down for the right reasons? Because, as they said in the Phantom Toll booth, you often learn more by being wrong for the right reasons than you do by being right for the wrong reasons. Yeah. So it's a question of, why are we doing these things? Setting a police station on fire is not a moral or immoral action. It's just an action. Mm-hmm. The question is, why did we do it? What is the result of us doing it? What will we achieve by doing it? What is the benefit of doing it? These are the questions that have to be asked. And I know those questions are sometimes annoying because we just want to get things done. We just want to torch the police station. But if we don't do the work and we don't ask ourselves why, then we're not going to get anywhere when it's all said and done.
These statues and also distract from the entire truth to an individual. Whereas if we didn't have the statue, we have more, like, if we were to just look at all the information that's available to us about that person, we would have a different opinion about whose statue we should have up versus whose statue we shouldn't have up. Those statues are up because a small group of people decided to have them up based on their perspective of how they view that person. It's not the objective perspective of what they did overall, right? Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I highly recommend you guys to tune in also to Israel's channel on Big Talk, Little Talk, where we will further discuss some of these topics, especially the thing about statues, because there is a lot of disagreement with that among me and some of the other guys that participate in some of these panel discussions. Dak, I thank you so much for coming on. We need to have more philosophical discussions about things like morality, things like consciousness, things like the ego, which we could discuss about in another topic. And this can influence us and clear our minds better with how we perceive things that are happening in our politics and in our world. So thank you guys so much for watching. Dak, thanks again for coming on. You want to give a final shout out on where people can find you?
Yeah, I haven't been writing too much lately or making videos. Things have been a little difficult for me lately, but my writing, when I get back to it, it will be at overwritten.org. I'm still on Twitter for some reason, and I have been on Big Talk, Little Talk before. Something tells me I'll be there again, so thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you guys so much. Don't forget to stay informed. Thanks for watching that segment of Hear Me Out. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell down below so you can get the latest on sports, pop culture, and progressive politics. Stay informed.